This is my fight song. Take back my life song. Prove I'm alright song.
Φίλοι μου, σήμερα φιλοξενώ τον ψυχοθεραπευτή δόκτορα Jerry Marzinski, με τον οποίο προβλέπεται να κάνουμε ένα πολύ ενδιαφέρον ταξίδι στα άδυτα της ψυχιατρικής, των ψυχιατρικών ιδρυμάτων και των ψυχιατρικών κλινικών στις φυλακές, καθώς και τη συνάρτηση της ψυχιατρικής με τις μεγαλοφαρμακευτικές. Μια σημείωση πριν αρχίσουμε: οι εικόνες που θα δείτε σε αυτό το βίντεο είναι από την εικόνα, από εικόνες του ίδιου, από διάφορα ψυχιατρικά ιδρύματα στα οποία έχει δουλέψει. Dr. Marzinski, welcome to my channel and thank you so much for accepting my invitation for a discussion on paranoid schizophrenics and much more related to your work. Before we begin, please introduce yourself to my audience, and then, of course, tell me how it all started for you to lead you to the research you did with the incredible findings.
Well, first of all, I'd like to tell your audience what an incredible person you are. I mean, Vicki has reached out across the oceans and the continents because she was tuned to the vibration of this message, and all of a sudden she appeared in my mailbox with a lot of energy and saying, you know, hey, let's do this in Greek. And I'm like, whoa. So she has pushed this through. She is, you know, she is very impressive. So it's good to be here.
Oh yeah, I'm so happy to have you here. I'm excited and I'm honored. So please take the floor.
Okay. Well, yeah, briefly, I'm not a psychiatrist, but I am a licensed psychotherapist in the United States. I've got over 35 years of experience on the front lines of some of the most dangerous psychiatric institutions in this country. If 30 years ago I was to hear the story I'm about to tell you, I wouldn't have believed it. You know, if I hadn't experienced these things for myself, I probably still wouldn't believe it. So after graduate school, I was employed for 7 years at the largest psychiatric hospital on the planet. This place was immense. It was the size of a city. It sprawled over 2,000 acres with a population of about 10,000 people. By the time I got there, it was 13,000 a few years earlier.
Wow.
And yeah, it was massive. And virtually every mental illness known to man was to be found somewhere in that place. And being stupid and young, I was fascinated with, you know, abnormal psychology, and I'm like, okay, this is where it's at. So, you know, you really couldn't get into a place like this unless you had a college education to work with these. So it's almost like, okay, we're keeping this population sequestered off from everybody except those who have been programmed by the system, except for attendants and those kind of guys. But people who are actually trying to do therapy with these guys had to go through the educational system, which was very different.
Oh,
so
boy.
That's what it took to get access.
Yep.
Yeah, so, you know, as soon as I got there, I began questioning these guys, the psychotic patients, about the voices they were hearing. And I saw that they were, you know, the voices, whatever they were getting these guys in a lot of trouble. And I got into a fair amount of trouble several times with psychiatry for doing this. They pulled me up on the carpet and said, the voices are hallucinations. You know, what you're doing by asking these patients questions about what they're hearing is just reinforcing these hallucinations and making the patient worse. But even before the first time I got pulled up on this, I realized that something else was going on, and that these things were not hallucinations. So by the end of my 7th year at the hospital, I was virtually certain that these things were not hallucinations, but I wasn't exactly sure what they were. Now, they did appear as thoughts in the patient's mind, but they were very different than their normal thoughts before these things took over. So at the time the hospital closed down due to Proposition 13, I was still at a loss. My denial system, I just didn't want to believe that these things were anything other than some segment of the patient's subconscious mind. And every time I thought they might be something else, it was like I kind of pushed that out of my head. And that denial system started taking some blows. So,
No wonder.
Yeah.
Just a little, something that came to me now. Do they really know where the subconscious mind is actually located in the brain?
They do not. And that's the problem with these guys. If they can't see it, hear it, or measure it, it doesn't exist.
So it's really a theory, an axiom, okay? It's not proven. They can't even prove it exists in the brain, right?
Well, what they do is they can poke some electrodes in there and stimulate certain areas of the brain, which brings up memories.
Yep.
Which is interesting. But as far as the subconscious, it's kind of like a theoretical construct.
Exactly.
So what didn't make sense with these voices were they were insisting they were hallucinations, but hallucinations are all over the place. They're positive, they're negative, they're neutral, they're just everywhere. There is no pattern to them whatsoever.
Many different kinds.
Many different kinds.
Right.
And they're calling these voices hallucinations, but it didn't take long to see that there was a pattern to these voices. And the voices were consistently negative. They seldom, if ever, said anything positive to the patient, and if they did, it was only to produce a negative result later. So there was a pattern to them, and it was unswerving. It didn't move. It was like a red light. I mean, it was like a beacon. Like, okay, if these hallucinations do not run fixed, predictable patterns, but yet, the psychiatry and the rest of the staff kind of closed their eyes to that.
I wonder why. I mean,
probably like
dogma, isn't it?
Well, it is. I mean, the first of all is their programming within the educational system. Now, one thing that I had that most of them didn't is from the time I was a child, I was programmed not to trust authority. And that was from a very early age. And it went up until my college years, and I watched them lying about Vietnam, and I watched Richard Nixon lying over and the news lying every night over the mainstream media. So there was my trust for the government and that authority gone. And the way I was programmed.
If you question the governments, you're a conspiracy theorist?
Yes, a conspiracy theorist.
Or a terrorist, or both.
Or both. You're just an unsavory character. But, matter of fact, the other day that the sky over here was full of chemtrails. And I called the local radio station. I said, hey, go outside and look. These trails are toxic. They're full of aluminum. They're filling the sky with them. Oh, they're harmless. They're completely harmless. That's a conspiracy theory. I said, well, go look out yourself and see what you're breathing up there. I mean, that's
Nothing
aluminum, all kinds of stuff. Nothing to see here.
America. Nothing to see here.
Nothing to
Greece.
see. Yep. And it's amazing how many people don't notice that because, they've been told it's a conspiracy theory. So what the psychiatrists have been taught by the educational system that has been taken over by big pharma is that these things are hallucinations and that the only way to treat them is with drugs. Now, matter of fact, back in the 1920s, before the AMA and Big Pharma was so powerful, there were all different kinds of therapies available, electrotherapy and hypnotherapy and all kinds of different therapies, naturopath stuff, and all of them were kind of equal and kind of vying for which was the most effective. 10 years later, in the 1930s, the Medical Association came up with something called the Flexner Report that resulted in the banning of every form of healing taught in higher education except for their pharmacology-based model, which they were making a fortune off of. So they basically knocked everything else out and taught us that that's the only answer. There's a pill for everything, and we'll make these pills, and we're going to sell these pills. So we've been programmed to believe that there are no other worlds. It's only physical. All problems are physical, and it's some kind of chemical imbalance. And that's what psychiatry has been programmed since the 30s. And they don't...
John Rappaport writes...
Exactly.
Talking about Mr. Breggin, I think, that the effort to develop, he says, and market hundreds of dangerous psychiatric drugs stemmed from an agreement between the profession of psychiatry and pharmaceutical companies. Right?
Right, that's exactly right. Matter of fact, if you go back into the history, back when I first hit the state hospital, the DSM, I think it was 2 or 3 at that time, it only contained maybe 75 or 100 disorders. So the psychiatrists get together, every few years, and they add a bunch more. And so they have the symptom complexes, and they invent them.
Scores of new mental disorders. That's right.
And what they used to have, which was, it shows you how far they'll go, is they used to have something in there called the Southern Belle Syndrome. I don't know if you know anything about the U.S. Southern Belles, but, it's like Gone with the Wind, if you ever saw that movie.
Yep.
Yeah.
Of course.
So they had that in their DSM as a disorder. They had homosexuality in their DSM as a psychiatric mental illness.
Yeah, look, the more disorders they invent, the more drugs they produce, you see.
Well, yeah, the drug companies come right up behind them.
Exactly.
And they sell this poison on the television. So you turn on the television and 90% of the commercials are drug commercials saying if you have this illness, and then they'll lay out all these symptoms, we have this drug to cure it. Ask your doctor to prescribe this to you. And so what they're doing is selling illness so they can make a profit. So they're brainwashing people into thinking they are sicker than they actually are. And people are buying it. So we've got to learn how to heal ourselves.
Exactly.
So, back in those days, I'll briefly go through my kind of history here. Yeah, so after seven years at the state hospital, where I was getting in trouble for asking patients about their voices, and they would get upset when they were asked about this, because I didn't know this for maybe a decade and a half, 2 decades later, is the voices themselves were making them upset because they didn't want anybody questioning the patient about what they were and how they operated.
Exactly, because if they were found out,
Yes.
it wouldn't be to their advantage, of course.
Oh no, they want to operate in the dark. They want this hallucination
Yeah, they
thing.
love the
They love it.
psychiatrists saying
Yeah.
it's hallucinations. That's right.
Exactly. Because as long as it's a hallucination, it's nothing you can do anything about. It's out of your hands. So that's one of the first things, I noticed there. After 7 years with the state hospital, Proposition 13 came through, and they were closing down all the psychiatric hospitals all over the U.S. and saying they were going to treat them in local mental health centers, and that was better for them, and it would have been cheaper. The problem is that schizophrenics, the voices don't want those medications, and they will drive them away from psychiatrists. And that was
the medications apparently suppress the voices.
That's exactly what they do. They don't cure anything, and they just suppress the voices. And the reason they do that is because they calm the patient down.
Right.
And the voices don't want that. They want the patient all worked up, negative, and all upset.
Exactly.
All right. So, after 7 years at the state hospital, I'm just kind of breezing through a real brief history.
Yeah.
I was pretty certain that these things were not hallucinations, but I wasn't sure exactly what they were. And I didn't want to believe that they were demons. So as the hospital was closing down, I applied for admission to, I'd already had my master's degree by then. I applied for admission to a PhD program, and supposedly one of the best in the country. And to my surprise, I was admitted. And I was thinking in the back of my mind that, these things were thoughts, and the crux of this situation is, where do these thoughts come from? Because they're not normal thoughts, and it was very difficult to get these people to talk about these voices. So I'll go into that a little later, because they're embarrassed about what these things were saying. There is no positive benefit whatsoever for them to talk to anybody about these things, because it's always caused them trouble. So to talk to somebody working in my field about these things usually meant that if they complained too much, they were going to be drugged more heavily by the psychiatrist. And our job was to kind of be the watchdogs for psychiatry. If we see somebody go off their meds or getting crazy, we were supposed to refer them to psychiatry, who would then drug them or change their medications. So while I was in the doctoral program, I was there for years, and they hadn't mentioned anything about where thoughts come from, or what I was looking for. And I was thinking they were hiding that information up there. And after 2 years, I was kind of suspecting that they didn't know anything, or weren't even looking at it. So one day, the head of the department was teaching us how to lie with statistics and get away with it. I just couldn't believe this. And after the lecture, he said, "Is there anybody who has any questions over anything?" And I raised my hand and said, "Where do thoughts come from?"
Kudos for you.
He looked at me like I had fallen out of a spaceship right at his feet. He just stood there with his mouth open and stared at me. And he didn't know what to say. And then he said, I'll meet with you after the lecture, and we'll talk about it. So he kind of pushed it off that way. After the lecture, he kind of ran out of the room. After 7 years working the front lines in the state hospital, I was asking these guys a lot of questions that didn't match up with my experiences working there.
You were bugging them.
I was bugging them, and they did not like it.
Of
You know,
course.
so you're not supposed to ask questions. You're not supposed to question their authority. You just memorize what they tell you to and spit it back. You know?
And I'm sure when you asked the guy you asked, where do thoughts come from, I'm sure he ran away and he avoided you completely after the lecture, didn't he?
Well, he kind of did, but he also spread that to the other professors. You know, hey, this guy's a weirdo. You know, and you know, I'd already gotten into a few scrapes asking them questions about what they were teaching, and they didn't like that. So it was a spiritually bone dry place. They never talked about spirit. They didn't want us reading stuff about, you know, spirit or other kinds of therapies like Gestalt therapy or, you know, any of the hypnotherapy, anything that didn't fit what they thought was proper. They didn't want us looking into.
And that is ironic, to say the least, because psyche in Greek means soul, for goodness sake.
Well, they didn't even believe in a soul. Matter of fact, this fellow who was, I asked that question to, who was teaching us to lie in statistics, was an ex-preacher, of all things.
Oh, boy.
So he was supposed to be an ex-man of the cloth, and here he was teaching us how to lie, formally teaching us how to lie with statistics. And I'm like, I looked around, and there was only one other guy in the room who was on my vibration. We looked at each other and then real quick looked back so he didn't see us. But the rest of them were just kind of staring straight ahead, kind of like going, whoa, so that's how it works. And I'm like, I can't believe this.
Oh,
So, you know, after years of that, I just couldn't stand it anymore. I started getting more and more depressed, more disillusioned with their ego games and their deceptions. And with almost a straight A average, I left that program and went to Arizona, where I took on a position as a psychiatric evaluator in a large county emergency room. I spent a year there and then spent 2 years working at the largest, I left there, spent 2 years working at the largest mental health center in this city. And after 2 years there, I landed a job in the psychology department of the state prison here. And I stayed there studying schizophrenics for the next 16 years. By that time, they'd closed down almost all the state hospitals, and the state prisons were now the state hospitals. So when I got on board, here's all these schizophrenics that I used to work with at the state hospital. We're now...
Sorry, it's my dog barking. Excuse that noise.
No problem. I got a couple of them hanging around here, too, that might go off.
I have this German Shepherd. He looks like a bloody bear, and he sounds like it, too. Anyway, carry on, please. Sorry for interrupting.
All right. So here I was faced with the same patients that I was in the state hospital, but these guys had now committed some kind of crime to get there, where most of the ones I was working with in the state hospital were not criminals. And that went all the way up the line to psychotic patients who had murdered people or seriously hurt them. But what I was able to do at the state prison, where I wasn't able to do at the state hospital, was to form a group of inmates who were as curious about their voices as I was, and who were willing to report to me everything their voices were telling them as we were talking, and then go out and try some things over the next week and report back as to how those things affected their voices. So this was very unusual, because most of these people did not want to speak to anybody, much less alone a psychiatrist or somebody in psych, about these things, because you look what happened to them when they did. So most of them were traumatized in earlier years to start with.
Yep.
So here they start hearing these voices, and they go to their parents or their wife or somebody, and they go, well, I'm not feeling well. I'm hearing these things, and they tell them what they're saying, and they get scared, and friends start backing away, and going, "You're weird," or "You're possessed," and they lose friends, and then as the situation gets worse, they tell their family members, and their family members freak out, take them to a psychiatrist, and the psychiatrist basically diagnoses them as being lunatics. They're hallucinating. Their brains are broken due to a chemical brain imbalance, and they can't be fixed, and there is no solution, and you have to take these toxic drugs for the rest of your life, or you will get psychotic again. And
brain imbalance, another theory, because no lab tests.
That's not even a theory. That's bull crap. I mean, that whole, it's not even a theory anymore. It's been disproved. They have, like you said, they have no lab tests. They have no MRIs. They have nothing except shooting off their big mouths to sell their drug.
Prove it. Nothing to substantiate it.
A correlation. That's it. A correlation. They give these guys these psychoactive drugs, and they calm down, and the voices diminish and sometimes go away. But for 10 years after these psychotropic drugs came out, they had no idea why they worked at all. None. They knew if they gave it to them, they worked. It was 10 years later when the pharmaceutical industry got hold of this that they began putting out, well, this is a chemical imbalance. And that's what their sales reps were told to say. So here they are teaching this bullcrap in the higher education medical schools, and students don't know any different. They don't question this. So here's all these psychologists and psychiatrists coming out of medical schools believing everything they were told, and these were hallucinations, and there was no cure, and the only thing they can do is to drug them, and that
easy way out and the profitable. So
very profitable. Those drugs are very, very expensive, and they're also very toxic. So with long-term use, they kill your brain cells. They destroy your peripheral nervous system. You are not the same, and it is not reversible past a certain point. So you start this shaking that can't be stopped, and your tongue comes out of your mouth, and your arms are shaking, and your body's shaking, and it's all due to these drugs destroying your nervous system. I never saw a psychiatrist at the state hospital tell patients that this would be the result of long-term use of these drugs. They had nothing else to treat these people with. So the only time these patients found out about these things is when they started experiencing them, and then they went to the psychiatrist, and they either quit their medications and got psychotic again, or they went to the psychiatrist and said, "Hey, I'm shaking all over. I feel bad. That there's a whole bunch of horrible side effects to these things," and the psychiatrist would say, "Oh,
addiction too, I guess, if they're shaking."
No, I don't think so. It's not anything that anybody would ever get addicted to. These things are awful. Now some of them to calm them down, other than the psychotropics like Xanax, which are benzos, and Librium and Librex and those kind of drugs, they will calm them down, but they are addictive. And what they used most to combat the side effects of these toxic drugs was something called Cogentin back in my day, and that would kind of ameliorate the negative side effects and allow them to keep using these drugs until the person's nervous system was completely burnt out. So at the state hospital, the name of the game was control, and they used to do that control by shock treatments. So back at Central State, even when I was there, they were giving these horrible shock treatments. I witnessed one, and I almost fainted. I never fainted at seeing anything, but when I saw this, it was more than I can take, and I almost went down. I clutched onto one of the pillars, and had I not done that,
my God.
Yeah, and I sent you a picture with a room with these
Yes.
pillars in there, and it was that was very similar to the room they were giving that shock treatment in. So,
Terrible stuff.
oh, it is. I mean,
Inhumane, totally inhumane.
they were doing, I think it was 3,000 of those a year back in the 1950s. It was either 3,000 a year or 3,000 a month. I forgot which one. But they would basically stun these guys, and it was also used for punishment because the people who were recommending it were not the doctors. They were the attendants on the unit who were saying, this guy needs a shock treatment because he's out of control. And the psychiatrists were glad to oblige. So they just lined them up, and it was like a factory, one after the other. They just were electrocuting their brains and doing massive damage to their brains. And
That is satanic practice, if I ever heard one, really.
Well, when you go back a little earlier, before the drugs, all they had was, straitjackets.
Yeah.
And I've seen those, and I talked to some of the older attendants that have been around for a while, and they used to have these horrendous battles with these psychotic patients, and both sides got hurt. Because psychotic patients get extremely strong, supernaturally strong, and I have a story about that if we ever get to it. But
We will. If it'll take us days, we will.
it just might. So the difference between the state hospital and with regard to experimenting with this stuff is that the ongoing general rule at the state hospital was that you do not upset psychotic patients no matter what, unless you're in imminent danger or they're endangering themselves. You don't just poke around in their heads and get them upset for your curiosity, because they never know what they're going to do, and they're always going off their meds all the time, and they can get violent, and the place was extremely understaffed all the time. So they didn't want you upsetting these guys. So if they found out I was asking questions about the voices, which upset these patients, they really
Fired.
put me up. Yep, they put me on the red carpet, man, and knock it off. But when I got to the state prison, I mean, a patient complaining about a psych person asking them about their voices, which might upset them some, didn't even break the ambient noise level there. I mean, it was not even near the top. I mean, it was.
So the prison is where the fun starts now for
But
you.
the prison is where the real information started coming out. Now,
And the research.
and the real research, although I did do a fair amount at the state hospital. So while at the state hospital, 7 years, I mean, it was slow going. It was inch by inch by inch. First, I had to find out what I had to do to get these people to trust me, which they didn't trust any psych, because they knew that if you complained about the voices, you'd be sent to the psychiatrist, and they would drug you senseless. And that was my job, was to monitor their medications, and if they went off, I was supposed to turn them in.
You were
So
supposed to.
I was supposed to. And if their voices got too bad, I was supposed to tell psychiatry about that also. And if they went off and they did something bad and they found out that I knew about it, I would be in trouble. So it was like walking on a razor blade.
Exactly.
Between trying to figure out how to get this information out of these people and trying to stay out of trouble with psychiatry and the authorities there who didn't want these guys.
That was brave and admirable of you, I must say.
Well, it was either that or it was stupid.
No.
So I was in trouble a fair amount.
Yeah,
Um,
I can imagine.
And but what I did see when I first got to the state hospital, and I didn't know that these hallucinations that they were speaking of were voices. They didn't say that in any. By that time, I had an undergraduate degree in psychology from Temple University, and I had a master's degree from the University of Georgia. And in 6 years, they didn't mention that these hallucinations were voices. They just said, well, they're hallucinations, and they just briefly, kind of went over it, and they kind of glossed over it. Well, these guys are hallucinating. They're disorganized. Let me see, what was the other thing? They can't do advanced planning. So the first thing I saw was that the psychotic patients were doing really bizarre stuff, and nobody seemed to know why. And I remember the first encounter at Central State. There was no cell phones at that time. There were no radio phones. They were the pickup phones. There was no internet. The grapevine at the hospital was the hospital cafeteria where everybody would meet to eat, and that's where the news from throughout this entire giant hospital complex, consisting of over 200 buildings, would kind of flow through there. So it would be the place where that was the news station for the hospital.
Right.
So one of the first crazy things I remember hearing was that one of the patients in a unit where a friend of mine was working had cut off his penis.
Oh my goodness.
With a razor blade, and the administration or the hospital tried to sew it back on. And the talk of the lunchroom for a couple of months after that was whether it was taking or not. So that was the scuttlebutt there. So there were some weird conversations that went on in that place.
Of course.
So a friend of mine, Ed, worked in that unit where this guy had done that. So one day at lunch, I asked Ed, I said, do me a favor, go look this guy up and ask him why he did that. And I'll meet you at dinner. You come back and tell me what he says. I was curious. Nobody else was curious, So he did that. He come back at dinner, and I said, you talked to him? And he goes, yeah, I sure did. I said, well, what did he say? Well, he said he didn't need it anymore. And that was it, period.
Oh, my God.
So I went, okay. and then it was a very strange world in there, and it's a place where the majority of the human race has never been and won't go, because it's a totally different world in there.
Of course.
So let me say, what was the next one that came through? There was a building they called the Building for the Criminally Insane. And what was odd about that building is that nobody knew anybody who worked there. So people from all over the hospital would come eat in the cafeteria, but nobody from the Building from the Criminally Insane would come to the hospital and eat. So nobody knew anybody there. And it was the only unit in the entire 200-building hospital that I couldn't get into, nor could anybody else unless they worked there. So every once in a while...
That's weird.
We thought it was weird, too. And I even tried to get in there. They would not allow us in. So for me, every time I drove past that place, and I sent you a picture of it. It's the brick building with the balcony.
Okay.
And every time I drove by that place, I would look and go, I wonder what is going on in there. What are these people like? What are these patients like? And every once in a while, a story would leak out. And one of the first was of an airline pilot who had murdered his wife. Now, this guy had just been flying airlines until recently. And he had murdered his wife because he had this delusional disorder where he believed that the wife was turning his son into a homosexual. So he ended up in there. And just months before, he was flying airliners.
Oh, my Lord.
So it's like, you know, that kind of like, you know, I'm like, okay, I wonder what else is in there. And there was one other story kind of crept out of there, but I forgot what it was.
But your curiosity must have been ablaze. I mean, really.
Well, every time I drove by, I looked at that place, yes, and I was curious. I didn't know back then that I would be spending 16 years with these same kind of people on some of the, you know, highest custody units in the state prison. They were the same kind of people. And I had no idea that.
Well, now the fun begins. And now I suggest we take a little break and come back with the big stories that you have to tell us, and your experiences, and your research, of course.
Well, like I said, that may take a while.
Yeah, well, we'll take a break and we'll be back in a jiffy, okay?
Okay. All right.
You can continue, my dear Dr. Mrzinski. Oh, it's so difficult to pronouncing that name.
Okay, well, let me finish up just the introduction here, because it's kind of spread out a little longer. Yeah. So, I spent 16 years studying these voices that these prisoners heard at the prison, and kind of was trying different things with them. And after many years, they started recovering. And that's when I got into some trouble with the chief psychologist. I thought they'd be happy about this, and they weren't.
And I'm sure you were the catalyst for their recovery, right?
Oh, paranoid schizophrenia can be cured without medications. Completely cured. You know,
okay.
It is not a chemical imbalance. It is not a physiological disease. It's a spiritual disease.
Right.
And it's got to do with your mind and your thinking. So I think all of us has kind of been at one time or another wondered what it was like to go insane. You know, and there have been times where we might have thought ourselves that we were going crazy. And I know while all this was going on, there were many times I wondered if I weren't going crazy, because you can't talk to anybody about this. You know, the voices come out and they start talking to you. You have patients telling you the voices are cursing you, and you know, then strange things starting to happen as they began recovering, and there is nobody you can talk to about this that won't think you're not totally insane. So for years and years, I had to keep this to myself.
Oh,
and I had
so difficult. I can imagine how difficult that was. Not being able to share your thoughts, and you know.
Well, I could, but I could only. The only people who understood were the psychotics themselves. So it was like I was in there with them, and I had a foot in each world. So it was like, okay, you know, I could talk to these guys, but if, you know, one of the psychiatrists ever saw that I was doing that and what we were talking about, you know, I'd probably be fired instantly, or they would have their minds warped. And one of the reasons I got into trouble was that I would spend 3 and 4 hours talking to a psychotic patient in a session because it was so fascinating, and none of the other psych staff could stand being around them for any more than 20 minutes. And then they'd scoot them out. You on your drugs? Okay, you're good. The voice is under control.
I want you to clarify something. When we're talking about a psychotic patient, we're not talking about a schizophrenic one, are we?
Well, a psychotic is kind of a generalized catch-all for all kinds of craziness. Now, what we'll be specifically speaking about in this documentary are paranoid schizophrenics and paranoid schizophrenia, because the information that I'm going to put out only is relevant to them, but they are one of the largest classes of schizophrenics. And it's one of the top 10 maladies in the world. It's one of the top 10 health problems in the world. And this is this information has to get out.
Yep.
So
that's why we're doing this show.
That doesn't mean that medications don't have a place, because there are a number of times where I could not reach a schizophrenic patient without those medications calming him down. There was just, the voices were so loud and so strong that they just completely overwhelmed me until, maybe 25 years later, when I understood how to shut them up. And then I could get through to them. And that was very useful in the emergency rooms. For the 10 years I worked in emergency rooms doing psych crisis. But you're going to get a first-class tour of the psychotic mind tonight. And this is information that doesn't exist in too many places, or just spotty. So, it all centered around the distrust of authority that I started with.
And that's what everyone should be doing. Distrusting authority, questioning authority every single minute of the day.
Yeah, agreed. And one of the first, what I hated about undergraduate psychology is that they would not give you access to a clinical population. You had to believe what they said was the truth. All you were given was a textbook. You were to memorize that textbook and spit it back out.
Dogma again, and the textbook was the Bible.
And that was the Bible.
Yep.
Now, I started seeing cracks in that when I started looking up the references for where some of this stuff comes from. So you go back to in the back of the book, and this guy got it from this guy, who got it from this guy, who got it from this guy. It wasn't original information. They were kind of taking information from each other, recombining it, and putting it in this textbook because they agreed on it, and that should be the reality, even though most of them had very little time on the front lines in mental health. And if they did, it was like a student counselor or a university counselor. It was lightweight stuff. It wasn't working in the mental health centers. It wasn't working in the psychiatric hospitals or the ERs. These were academics. So what it reminded me of is when I was scuba diving, I remember watching this little colony of fish, and they had built mounds around themselves, and those mounds were composed of pebbles. So here's this whole city of these little fish, and I'm sitting there at 50 feet, just fascinated watching these little fish. Mm-hmm. So what would happen is they would look, just their heads would be out of these holes, and they would look around for somebody who had left their hole to steal a pebble from somebody else, and then another one would come and steal a pebble from that one's hole. So they were stealing all these pebbles from each other. And the only ones bringing in fresh pebbles were the ones on the outskirts who were taking the most risk. They were venturing out into the ocean where there were no colony, where there was no warning from other fish that something was coming, and they were grabbing a fresh pebble and bringing it back to their nest, and then they were having their pebbles stolen by all these other guys. That's exactly what this reminded me of when I started looking into the textbooks. And now fast forwarding maybe 20, 25 years in the future, there were a couple of things that those textbooks said, or readings that we were assigned said, that stuck in my mind as this is preposterous. And one of them was a paper that a psychologist had written. Now, by the way, you know, what you can't take the information these guys are doing and replicate it in a normal manner. And those who have tried, there's something like a 90% failure rate where they cannot replicate what these people are saying. So that increased my distrust even further. Where, you know, if you're an engineer or something, you could go into a lab and you can test these principles and see them work. The only place you could do that in psychology was an experimental psychology where you can actually watch these things happen. But the rest of it, there was no way to prove anything. You just had to buy what they were saying, and that didn't sit well with me. And that started cracking when one day I read an assigned paper that said if two delusional patients, and I believe this was in abnormal psychology, which I loved, if two delusional patients with the same delusion met one another, one of them would have to give way and change to another delusion. So I'm like thinking, why would that even have to happen? You got two crazy people here. Why would one of them have to change his delusion?
Yeah.
So this other guy can have the original delusion, and they both don't have the same delusion. So fast forwarding maybe 15 years into the future, I was walking. That wasn't even that far. Maybe 10 years. I was doing my rounds on one of the psychiatric units one day, and I spotted this new fella who was walking around talking to himself, and I knew he was talking to his voices, and you know, kind of crept up near him and was listening the best I can. And then when he noticed me, I said, "Hey fella, how you doing? You know, what's your name? You know, I haven't seen you here before." And he in fact was new and had come in, you know, the day before. And I right away I pick up on new patients to kind of see what's up with them. And I said, "Well, you know, what's your name?" And he looked me right in the eye and he said, "I'm Jesus Christ." And I went, "Okay." So I remembered back to what this guy said in this paper, and I said, "This is the perfect time to check that out." So I looked him in the eye and I said, "No, you're not, because I'm Jesus Christ."
Oh, boy.
And I sat there waiting anxiously for a response. And it kind of took him back. And he's thinking, and he's standing there thinking. And then after, you know, he turns his attention back on me, and he looks at me and he goes, "Okay, we can both be Jesus Christ." And he walks off. I'm like, okay, what other lies did they feed me with
Exactly.
in college? What other lies did they feed me with? Well, another one that had stuck in my mind was that, you know, schizophrenics are too disorganized to do advanced planning. So one day I'm sitting in my office and I get a call from my friend Ed in another unit. He said, you got to come over here and see this before they clean it up. And I said, well, what? And he said, you just get over here as fast as you can. So in Ed's unit, there was a psychiatrist. They didn't have these top-level psychiatrists in the state hospital here. I mean, they were the bottom of most of them were the bottom of the dregs.
Yeah.
And this one was working Ed's unit. He had shown me him before, and this guy walked around with a beard and a mustache, just like Freud. He wore a coat just like Freud. He smoked a pipe just like Freud, and both of us thought he was really bizarre, And I didn't talk to him at all, but he said when I got to Ed's unit, he took me to this office and showed me this bizarre thing that had happened. So, what had happened is that this psychiatric patient, who is a schizophrenic, who lived on the 3rd floor of this unit, at 4 a.m, had somehow made it past 2 previous attendance stations that are manned 24 hours a day, and got down onto the 1st floor where the psychiatrist's office was, and somehow picked his lock, got into his office, got up on his desk, and crapped right in the middle of the desk. But not only did that, he shaped it into a pipe. Then he escaped the hospital. And they couldn't find him. He got away clean. And I'm standing there looking at this and thinking, schizophrenics are way too disorganized to do advanced planning. They're too, they're just 3 sheets to the wind. And this guy planned this and got away with it.
Oh, God.
So he didn't like this psychiatrist because he didn't like the medication that he was on, and he felt this guy was poisoning him. And, that was his final step.
It was a good plan then.
So there's 2 things that just jumped out in my face, about the educational system. I'm kind of going, okay, if they lied to me about these things, and they didn't go into detail about any of this other stuff, they can't be trusted. So, I just started making up, kind of seeing things for myself. And one of the first things I noticed was that psychiatrists throughout the hospital were being attacked by schizophrenic patients at a rate higher than any other medical staff, and that includes at a rate higher than psychiatric nurses, psychologists, and at a rate almost as high as attendants who are around these guys 24 hours a day.
I wonder why.
Well, why do you think? Well, so what was happening was that these psychiatrists, they had humongous caseloads. They were giant caseloads. One psychiatrist was responsible for sometimes an entire unit of hundreds of patients. So they could only see these people once or twice a month for maybe 15 or 20 minutes. So I looked this up, and they're being attacked at a rate of 3 to 5 times higher than all other medical staff. And that includes attendants who were spending 8 hours a day with these guys around the clock. So I'm wondering, either what are these psychiatrists doing to piss these people off in so short a time that nobody else is doing? And that was a mystery for years. I finally found out what it was, but it took years. So
what was the conclusion?
Well, the conclusion was that it wasn't the psychiatrists themselves; it was the medications they were giving these patients whose voices didn't like those medications, and the psychiatrists were viewed as a threat because those medications calmed the patient down and weakened the voices, and in some cases got rid of them temporarily. So at the time, I I wasn't aware that these were conscious entities. I just found this odd. Why were psychiatrists being attacked throughout this giant hospital at such a high rate? I had no answer at the time, but it was a medication merry-go-round. They would just drug these people, and that was it. So then I started asking staff, why are these patients behaving so bizarrely? Why are they always were kind of self-destructive and self-sabotaging, and they never seemed to be happy. Now, and they were committing suicide at a horrendous rate. There were 30,000 patients that never made it out of this hospital alive over the time it has been there, right. And the patient graveyard is humongous. I sent you a picture of that too with the wooden posts. But when I was there, those posts weren't there. What they had in a lot of cases was just a metal plaque with a number on it. Yep. So you really didn't know who was buried there. So yeah, the second thing I noticed was that schizophrenics would stay on the ward when the chaplain was having a ice cream social, where all the other patients would go down there, and they ice cream was and cake was hard to come by normally, and they would be down there gorging out on cake and ice cream and soda, but schizophrenic patients on my caseload would stay on the ward. And I noticed that, and I started asking them why. And it was like, we don't like chaplains. And then later on it would be, they didn't like us reading the Bible. And I'm like, well, what kind of hallucination doesn't like chaplains, tells patients to attack psychiatrists and get louder when the patient reads the Bible? Well, later I found
into demonic indications, right?
Yeah, but I was trying to blot those out of my mind. But yeah, it was like, why? If I'm being told these are hallucinations, this certainly doesn't fit the category of a hallucination. What kind of hallucination would tell a patient not to read the Bible? Why are hallucinations, they only attacking psychiatrists and not psychiatric nurses or psychologists or medical doctors? Why are they only attacking psychiatrists at such a horrendous rate? 5 times that of all other staff.
Yep.
These guys are getting, and it's not just there; it's all over. I went into the research, and they have it. Psychiatrists, and what's so fascinating is that not only is their assault rate 5 times higher than that of the normal population, their suicide rate is also. Their suicide rate is virtually exactly the same as that of the patients, the schizophrenics, and I found that fascinating, and that came out.
You mean the psychiatrist suicide?
Yes, the psychiatrist suicide rate is virtually identical to that of schizophrenic patients, and that blew me away.
Oh, that blows me away too now.
And I found that I think it was the NIMH, National Institute of Mental Health, did a study on that. So here you have the psychiatrists who are killing themselves at the same rate as psychotic patients. So it's like, wow, that's interesting. So I started experimenting with this thing at the state hospital, where they were told by the voices not to read the Bible or any spiritual stuff. And what I saw on their bedstands most of the time, if they were reading something, it was something negative. It was like murder mysteries or war stories or it was negative stuff. Yeah. So I found that interesting.
Yep.
So what I would do is get a passage from the Bible and a passage from one of these books they were reading, and I would get that patient who was reading that book, and I would make these two things about equal. So the passage from the Bible and a paragraph from one of these horror stories,
Yeah.
I would present both of them to the patient, and after they had read them, I would say, okay, write down everything you remember about what you have just read. And they remembered like 2 to 3 times more of the negative stuff than they did the Bible stuff. And that was objective, and I did that over and over and over again, and it was almost like there was another mind in there concentrating on the negative stuff, but they could not remember hardly anything of the Bible stuff, just a few words here and there, which I found very interesting. And then one day there was a psychologist who worked in the psychiatric rehabilitation center where I was stationed, and I was wondering, he was like a recluse. Nobody knew what he did in his sessions. And one day I found out he was working with a paranoid schizophrenic fella, and made arrangements to sit in that session with him, which he didn't like much, and found out that he was talking to the patient about his voices. He told them they were hallucinations. They weren't real, and to ignore them. And I could just look at the patient's face and see him kind of deflate. He didn't tell this guy anything more about his voices after that. So after we got out, a day or two later, I looked this patient up and I asked him, I said, well, how did the doctor's advice that you ignore the voices work? And he said, they get louder.
Huh.
They get louder. And one after another, they all said when they tried to ignore the voices, they would get louder. Now what kind of hallucination would get louder? Now, these are all things that people working in the field can check out for themselves. Don't believe me. Go look for yourself. You will see these things and more. There's more to come. It's out there. All you have to do is open your eyes. I'm pointing it out to you. Go look at it, and you will see how badly the wool has been pulled out from under your eyes with this. So we got that. So here's all this weirdness going on, and I would ask staff, the people who worked there much longer than I did, psychiatric nurses, every psychiatrist I ran into, it would be like, what's causing this? And it was all, it's a chemical imbalance. Their brain's broken.
This explanation, it's really frustrating with this explanation of chemical imbalance.
And that's what they believed. But as I watched them work, they never, ever ran a blood test, a urine test, any kind of test whatsoever to see what that balance was, if anything was ever out of balance, and if it was, what was out of balance that they were going to fix, and how were they going to fix it? There was nothing.
Nevertheless, it was a chemical imbalance.
Yes, because that's what they were taught, and that's what the drug representatives are telling them. And because it appeared those medications worked, at least temporarily, to suppress the symptoms, it must be something in the brain that is temporarily set right. Now, again, the only reason those things worked is because they calmed the patient down. And the voices weaken when that happens. So I'm asking this whole array of staff, and I asked one of the psychiatric nurses. I remember, why is this going on? She said, well, that's just a symptom of their mental illness, that they don't take their medications. So I noticed that working in a psychiatric rehab facility, we're trying to get these guys straightened out so they can go out and work. So in order to do that, you have to find out what's wrong with them. And what they were saying was wrong with them didn't match up with what I was seeing. So a chemical imbalance.
The more you talk, the more you're blowing my mind.
Well, my mind was blown too. So here's everybody tooting this chemical imbalance stuff, and here's a nurse saying, well, that's just a symptom of their illness, not taking their meds. That's just the way it is. And then you talk to some of the attendants who've worked with them for years and years, and they're saying, well, the reason they do that is because they're crazy. That's what crazy people do. And it's like they just accept it, and they're not curious about it. And the only thing they know to do about it is drug these guys senseless, and that's the job of the psychiatrist.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to, okay, this isn't adding up. What kind of a hallucination would act in this way? And that was just the beginning of it. Even to get that far, I had to learn why these people didn't want to talk about their voices, and had to be very careful about doing that, because if one of them got upset and went and told psychiatry that I was asking them about the voices and upsetting them, then I'd be in trouble. So I had to be very careful there.
Yep.
Let me see, what else did I learn while I was at the thing? At the very, what I saw happening is that these paranoid schizophrenic patients seemed to want to get better, but they did not want to stay on their medications.
Well,
they would,
doesn't it?
Well, no, it really doesn't. If they want to stay sane, they have to stay on their medicines, but they won't stay on the medicines.
Yeah,
so,
well, the voices kept telling them not to, I guess.
Yeah, but I didn't know that at the time.
Yeah.
I found that out after 7 years there. But at the time, it was like, why are these people going off their medications? And they would not just go off them once. They would go off them over and over and over. And the same thing would happen. So it would be like they are choosing to go psychotic. Now,
something
that's
worse
not
than taking the medication.
Yes, it's astronomically worst. It's like if you compared the two, it'd be like, okay, you've got two negative choices here. You've got to make one of them. You can have the flu, or you can have the bubonic plague.
Yeah.
And these guys were choosing the bubonic plague over and over and over and over again. Yeah, and you'd ask them why, and they would say, well, we don't like the side effects. And that's what the nurses would say. But, I'd say, well, I got to the point where I was actually measuring this. So what I started doing with every patient that came onto my caseload who was paranoid schizophrenic, I had a listing about 3 pages of psychotic symptoms, and all the bad ones associated with paranoid schizophrenia, everything I could find. And then what I would do was would ask them, and it was classical. You ask them, why'd you go off your medicines? Well, I don't like the way they make me feel. All right. Well, do you like going crazy? Do you like being psychotic? Well, no, I don't. So I'd give them a blank sheet of paper, and I'd say, write down every negative side effect that you experienced while taking these antipsychotic drugs. All right, so they put down 7 or 8 of them, and they weren't good. They weren't good. And then I'd give them like the 3 or 4 pages of psychotic symptoms associated with paranoid schizophrenia. Nightmares, voices, suicidal thoughts, hallucinations, seeing shadow. I mean, the whole gamut. and I'd say, okay, check off each of these symptoms that you've had when you went off your medications. And they would check off dozens of these horrible, horrible symptoms, life-threatening symptoms in a lot of cases. And then I would hand them both sheets back, and I'd say, which one is worst? And they would look at them, and they would say, well, being psychotic is worst. And I'd say, then why do you keep going off your medications? And they would say, I don't know. and that went on for years. It went on for years. They didn't know why they went off the medications, despite the fact that going crazy was much, much worse than the side effects of the medications, which in the long run would have destroyed them anyway. So close to a year before I left for the PhD program, there was one gal who had gone off her medications a number of times. She was doing good in class while she was on her meds, but as soon as she went off her meds, she just fell apart. She started acting bizarre, threatening, disrupting the class. And I got a call. She was in cosmetology class. I got a call from the cosmetologist to come down and get her out of there because she was like a caged animal. So I went down and got her, turned her over to the psychiatrist, and after he got back on the medications again, this was like the third time she'd gone off her meds, and the treatment team was talking about discharging her because she wouldn't stay on her meds. And the only way she was going to stay sane that they knew of was for her to stay on those meds, and she wasn't doing it. So if she's not doing it here, she's certainly not going to do it at home. So she was under consideration for discharge, and her mother called me from South Georgia and said, please don't do this. I can't handle her at home. I'm a single mother. I'm coming up there to talk to you. Can I come up Friday? And I said, well, okay, that's fine. I'll meet you Friday, and we'll talk to her together. So here we are both in the office. She comes in, and she's already kind of leveled out on her meds. So she's back with us again. And she knew she was in trouble and about to be discharged. And both her and her mother, me and her mother, are asking her, why do you keep doing this? You're on the verge of being thrown out of the program now because this is the third time you've done it. And they don't think you're serious. Why do you keep doing this? And she kind of looked at us, like cautiously, like she didn't want to say what she was about to say. And then she said, okay, I'll tell you why. The voices were telling me that the psychiatrist was poisoning me. And they pointed to the side effects of these medications as the result of being poisoned. So what the voices were doing were pointing to the negative side effects of the medications and telling the patient that she was being poisoned by the psychiatrist. And then click. That's why all these psychiatrists were getting beat up.
Yep.
And that was the only one who had admitted to the voices doing that, after like 6 years. So then I started asking other patients whether their voices were telling them not to take their medications also. And in some cases, they came straight out and said, yes, they're telling me that the psychiatrist is poisoning me and that, the side effects are the effect of that poison. But in most cases,
in the long run, it was a sort of poison. So
in the long run, it was a sort of poison.
Very far off.
No, they weren't. But back then, that was the only thing they had. And even now, they don't know about what I'm about to talk about. That's the only thing they had. That's the only thing they were told existed to treat schizophrenia were these major tranquilizers. And they still didn't know why they worked, even though they said they did. So here's all these things not adding up. and by the time I'd left the state hospital, I knew there was something wrong with the story that the establishment was feeding us. And so after I got out of the PhD program, I ended up working at, like I said, a county hospital, working psych crisis in the ER for a year, 2 years, in the largest mental health center in the city. And then I found a job in the state prison, where, like I said, all the schizophrenic patients that used to be living in the state hospital at half the cost are now living in the state prison at twice the cost, because now they have to provide security, and the treatment is way below community standards, which aren't great in the first place.
Now that doesn't make sense. Why would they do something like that? I wonder.
No.
Anyway.
Well, they think it was saving the money, but it's penny wise and pound foolish, because now they're thinking pushing psychotics is going to teach them something.
I'm losing you. Hold on a sec. Please repeat the last sentence, because I lost you there for a minute.
Okay, what I was saying is that somehow the American mentality is to punish transgressors that break the law. But, punishing a psychotic only makes them worse. And there's nobody who punishes them more than they punish themselves. Because the voices are telling them, to do all these weird things. Now, before I left the state hospital also, I watched the psychiatrist, when they learned that the voices were telling a patient to kill themselves, they would take that patient and they would drug him senseless and lock him up in a suicide watch until he was no longer suicidal or thinking about seriously killing himself. But everything else that the voices were telling them was a hallucination except for this, because the suicide rate of these guys was astronomical.
Yep.
So and the voices are telling virtually all of them to kill themselves at some point, and a lot of them are doing it. So they took that as real. That wasn't a hallucination, but everything else the voices were telling them was a hallucination and not believable, and they would just blow that off. So I found that very odd also. Then when I
heard several priests in radio shows telling, like George Norrie, Jeff Renz, Freeman Fly, and others, especially in the alternative field, that demonic possessions increased exponentially. Even the Vatican, according to the site Mysterious Universals, calling for more exorcists as demonic possessions increase. Do you think demonic possession is some kind of connection or correlation with schizophrenia?
Yes. Yes, there's a direct correlation. And they will not admit that, because we have been taught, and they have been taught, that there are no other worlds around us. That these other worlds don't exist.
A box, you see.
Oh yeah. So after they're being programmed that way, and they just don't believe, and in the PhD program, it was the most spiritually dry place I've ever seen in my life. I mean, my soul just shriveled up there. They didn't deal with anything spiritual whatsoever. It was all mind. Yeah. And that's what the establishment now has as with psychiatry. It's all mind. there is no spirit. There are no spiritual forces. And now they're finding out that there are, and there's more and more psychiatrists kind of waking up to this. And I think I sent...
Psychiatry ought to change its name then. Because studying the soul is rather spiritual than medical or medicinal or physical, you see. Because psychiatry means studying the soul.
Well, they certainly aren't doing that.
Yep. They changed the name of this science, quote-unquote science.
Well, what they've become is just high-paid pill pushers for the drug companies.
Exactly.
So, yeah, what I started learning at the state hospital was that the voices that these patients were hearing were always negative. You know, they weren't meaningless word salad. You know, so when you hear voices, you go, well, you know, they give you the impression that these voices don't mean anything. You know, that they're just word salad, that they're just a bunch of words. But no, they're far from it. You know, you creep up behind one of these guys and you listen to him talk to his voices, and it's a coherent conversation. It's like you're listening to somebody talk on the phone, but you can't hear the other party.
That's
right. But you know it's a coherent conversation. So here's all these things that just aren't adding up. You know, and the consistent pattern is that these voices are negative and destructive. So I really started being able to dig into this when I got into the state prison and found that the voices that these people were hearing some 2,500 miles away at the state hospital were the same voices that these prisoners were hearing 2,500 miles away in the prison here in Arizona.
Yep.
The same thing. I mean, they were all made from the same cookie cutter. And not only that, in the other institutions I've worked at, which was basically every major emergency room in this city, the voices are all telling these patients the same thing. A hallucination. They're all having the same mass hallucination. You know, 2,500 miles away, these guys are hallucinating the exact same thing that these patients at the state hospital were hallucinating. Come on, you know.
Ridiculous.
And yet they expect you to believe that. And from institution to institution. So different hospitals, different mental health centers, you know, all the different places I worked, the voices are the same. You know, they're doing the same thing. They're all negative. They're telling these people they're stupid. They're worthless. They're no good. That everybody's out to get them. I mean, Sherry has on her site a listing of hundreds of the negative things that these things tell these patients, and it's virtually anything that they know that will upset them. You know, so you know. One of the first people that I started working with in the prison was a guy who worked on Wall Street and got addicted to cocaine and a bunch of other drugs, amphetamine. He lost his job, he lost his marriage, and he ended up homeless and then in prison. And he was one of the first prisoners who would tell me everything about what his voices were telling him. So
do you think drugs promote schizophrenia? I mean, do these entities that enter these people's minds, are they helped with drugs?
Yes and no. Okay,
Could drugs make them open to
Yes,
hearing these voices.
yes, and one of the worst is amphetamine.
Yeah.
That's the one that these voices prefer the most. If they could get them on amphetamine, then
Okay.
they're happy as clams. And I've seen more patients go psychotic on amphetamine than any other drug.
I think
So-
it's useful for the people who are thinking of using, what you're saying here is very useful.
Well, what the voices want is they want a drug that makes you feel good at first, but then has a terrible withdrawal syndrome that makes you feel bad. So bottom line all through this is what these entities feed off, what the voices feed off is negative emotional energy.
Yeah, it seems that
So-
way.
So, well, it is that way. There's no seeming about it.
Some
So
people
after,
call them archons, some
Yes,
people call
that's
them jinn, others call them demons, Christians
name.
call them demons,
yep,
the Muslims call them jinn. Archons is an ancient Greek word which means overlords. So I think it's the same thing.
yes, we're talking about the same entities here. The voices are all those things. And one thing I noticed, and I couldn't figure it out for years while working at the prison, was that when the voices attacked these inmates after they left, they can be completely drained of all energy.
Energy, yep.
Some of them were so weak they couldn't even get out of bed, and that was a consistent correlation. Every time the voices attacked, they became depressed and weak, and couldn't get out of bed, couldn't function.
Well, of course, they were draining their energy.
They were draining their energy, and some of them actually said that they could feel their energy leaving when these things were attacking them.
Yeah.
And calling them all they're sucking them off. Now how they do that, I have no idea, but I've watched it happen.
It's got to do with electromagnetism. We are electromagnetic beings. If we weren't, cardiographs wouldn't work, So I think that's the key there, EMF.
I think you may be right, because they work toward getting the patient on the same negative frequency that they're on. And they have to do that in order to get their energy. They have to turn them negative.
I heard you talking to Robert Stanley, and I think you had an experience that is, as far as I'm concerned, in my mind, it correlates and it connects with EMF. Can you tell us about that experience, please?
EMS, the
EMF. Electromagnetic frequencies.
Well, there's two things I can say is that while working at the
crackling sounds you heard with
the crackling thing.
Yeah.
That was okay. Well, that's a third one. So okay, let me say that while I was working with these guys, the paranoid schizophrenics, I had to make a rule never to work with more than two of them at the same day. Otherwise, I would come home completely drained.
Exactly.
Yeah, and I couldn't function.
Makes sense.
The second thing is, they bring the patient to their same frequency. Now, when I started discovering ways to interfere with what they were doing, I had the voices. I had a group of I always had a group of prisoners around me. I treated them like gems, because very few people would actually tell you everything that their voices were telling them while you're talking to them. So it was like in real time I was able to experience what these guys were experiencing, but that took a while.
Fascinating.
That took a while to get there, because here we are in a prison they're prisoners. They've already been diagnosed as being psychotic and insane, and here they are telling a psych what their voices are telling them, and some of the times they were telling them to attack me. So again,
probably they knew you were onto them. That's why.
well, no doubt. But this was a big risk for these guys, because I could have them locked up in a heartbeat.
Yeah.
With any of the stuff that they were saying, and we both had to come to some kind of agreement, and I had to feel. It was a very fine balance, because I had to be able to tolerate their voices and what their voices were saying, and make a distinction between whether they were going to hurt somebody else in the process, and if their voices were getting too strong, and that they were getting dangerous. Now, I did not want to turn them in unless I absolutely had to, and seldom did I have to do that. But yeah,
you're still walking on eggshells, though.
Oh yeah, and this was a different kind of eggshell, though, because I had to balance out what I was supposed to do as an employee with, not, allowing these psychotic prisoners as much freedom as possible to speak of what they were experiencing, and not interfere or lock them down or have them increasingly medicated because of doing that. But on the other hand, I had to make sure or feel that they were safe, and that they weren't going to hurt themselves or anybody else in the process.
You were safe too. I mean, you wanted to help them, but not get out of line as well.
Well, that's where things became increasingly freaky. Exactly. So as I learned more about how to interfere with the things that these voices were telling these patients, and basically what I did is everything that seemed to piss the voices off, I told the patient to give them more of it, which upset them. But if you're going to be upset, the prison's the place to be, because everybody's upset there.
Right.
Staff and patients.
That's right.
So after a while, my little group started coming in as we developed more and more effective ways to interfere and short-circuit what these voices were doing, and they started reporting that their voices were getting angry with me, and they were telling them not to make their appointment, not to go to their appointment. They were telling them that I was stupid, that I was crazy, not to listen to anything I said. And it would be a battle when it came time for their appointment for them to show up, because they were fighting their voices the entire way. So incredible. So I was getting all these reports that the voices didn't like me, and I'm going, what kind of hallucination is it that doesn't like me? So those reports kept coming in, because
you still had caught on that this is different entities.
No, I was still blocking that out of my mind. I was thinking
you were still programmed by the system.
Well, I didn't. Yeah, I was programmed by the system, and I didn't want to believe it.
Although you were questioning the system, you were still programmed.
I was programmed, and if psychiatry ever found out that I thought these were demons, heaven forbid, they'd lock me up.
Oh yeah.
So for years, I thought it was the anxiety that these negative voices were causing that was draining these patients, because there was a consistent draining when the voices attacked, and I just blew it off as like, well, that's just the anxiety that they're experiencing, because these things are awful. I mean, they're terrorists. They're mental terrorists. They're evil things.
That's right.
So one day, when I was assigned to the jail for the prison, so this is the worst of the worst. This is where the worst inmates from throughout the entire prison are sent to the jail. and it's called the Central Detention Unit, and I was assigned there. So I always managed to get assigned to the most intense places, and I was an adrenaline junkie, so I didn't much mind it where others did. So one day I'm sitting in my office in another unit, and in comes these two letters. One from the captain of the Central Detention Unit saying, we have a psychotic prisoner here who was standing over his cellmate at 3 in the morning, just staring down at him, and he's freaking out his cellmate. You need to do something about this guy. You know, and then the second letter I opened up right on its tail was a letter from the guy, the prisoner who this crazy guy was standing over looking at, and I checked his records, and he had snitched off a major drug deal with the gangsters that were the prison gangsters were carrying out, and they wanted him dead. So they had already stabbed him. They wanted him dead so bad that some of their members got in trouble so they could be sent to the Central Detention Unit so they could have a chance to kill this guy. You know, because they didn't seem to care. They just wanted him dead because it must have been a huge drug deal that they lost out on. And here's this guy with the gangster, and I watch what they do. They sent these little notes across the whole entire floor of the cell block, and they would move at a tremendous rate, and they would go right under the door of whoever they were sending it to, and then somehow they had rigged it to where it would come off, or the person would take it off, and then they would pull the string back, and all this would happen in like a period of 2 or 3 seconds. It was just amazing how they did in there.
Yeah.
So here they were sending him these messages, you know, you come out of there, we're going to kill you. They'd already stabbed him once. He has to come out with a guard. He can't come out on his own. He has to go into a caged place where to get sunlight with nobody else out there. He's always got to be escorted. And on top of all that, he's got this psychotic guy staring at him at 3 in the morning, you know, who I don't know what this other guy did, this psychotic guy did, but to get in prison, but it wasn't anything good. And
Sure.
you know, there's nobody who could be under more stress than that guy, short of being in war.
Yeah.
You know, so I saw them back to back. I went over to the Central Detention Unit, saw it back to back, and I'm looking at these guys as they ascend the stairs, and then evaluating them when they come into the office, and really taking a close look at them. And the guy who wasn't psychotic, and they were both in the same cell, so they had the same food, the same conditions, the same guards. I mean, there wasn't a more perfect experimental situation than this.
Yeah.
You know, they were both in the same circumstances. There was nothing else that could interfere. You know, it was like a pure experiment that was already set up. And you know, when I watched them climb the steps, the guy who the gangsters were trying to kill looked like Superman compared to the psychotic prisoner, who could barely make it up the steps. And then when they came in for their interview, the guy that wasn't psychotic had 10 times more energy than the psychotic guy, who could barely get the words out of his mouth.
Yep.
And after I got done that interview, I went, it's not the anxiety. I mean, I knew it was clear. It wasn't the anxiety, you know. So something was taking their energy. And that's where I went, okay, the voices,
Yeah.
the voices are taking
Entities
their energy.
draining them.
Yes, but still I still wasn't fully able to admit that to myself. So here's all this evidence just mounting up in front of my eyes, this giant mound of evidence, and I'm still denying it. You know, I still won't admit to myself that these things are entities. So here I start getting all these reports from these guys I'm working with saying the voices are getting pissed off at you. And then one of them turns around as he's leaving one day, and he looks me straight in the eye, and he says, you know what you're doing is dangerous, don't you? And I just looked at him like, you know, I really hadn't thought about it, because I'm thinking that whatever these things are, there's still a part of me that thinking, well, maybe it's something else. But I'm thinking, whatever these things are, they can't come out of the head of the schizophrenic patient and get me. They live in their heads, not mine. They're infesting them, not me. And what is he doing telling me that what I'm doing is dangerous? Pissing off the voices, which are supposed to be hallucinations. So this is getting weirder and weirder. And well, that's loud.
That was a motorcycle passing under my balcony. Yeah.
All right. So let me see what happened with it. It happened with the same guy. So he tells me it's dangerous, and then and he's making good progress. His voices have decreased in amplitude. They've decreased in frequency, and he's looking more normal. He's taking more control.
Yep.
So he walks in one day without an appointment. He comes to my office, and he walks in and he looks at me and he says, "The voices want to talk to you." And I'm looking up at him like, "What?" they want to talk to me personally. That had never happened before, and that's like maybe 15, 20 years. That had never happened. It was always the patient would serve as an intermediary. So they would say, the voices are saying, "You're full of crap, you're stupid, you're crazy, you're insane, stay away from me," all this negative abuse. And I would say, well, tell the voices to go stick their heads where the sun don't shine, and this is like supposed to be a hallucination, but again, here's all this evidence in front of me. Even kind of an intermediary conversation with them, and I'm still not admitting that they're something separate.
Yeah.
So here he comes in and he goes, "They want to speak to you." And I'm like, "They want to speak to me personally?" And he said, "Yes." And I'm thinking, this is getting awful personal. So he sits down, and I'm looking at him like still kind of stunned. And I finally utter well, what do they have to say? And his voice got a little deeper. And these words came out of his mouth. He said, "You have no right to interfere with our way of life."
Wow.
And then he said, "That wasn't me who said that. That was them. That wasn't me." And I'm thinking, our way of life, plural.
Oh boy.
And I'm like blown away.
Of course you were.
It's like, that my denial system that was already in tatters had collapsed. It had collapsed. I mean, that was it. It wasn't holding up anymore after. It was like that wasn't the patient who said that, and I could feel it.
Yeah.
It wasn't him, and he was quick to say it wasn't him. And after he left, I was so stunned that I just canceled all my appointments for that day and just sat there weirded out. Like, what am I getting into here? Because I have no cognitive map. I'm not sure what's going on, and I have nobody to talk to except the psychotic guys themselves, who are telling me the voices are pissed at them. I can't go to my boss and say, "Hey, man, I just been told by the voices that I shouldn't be asking questions about them." I couldn't. Even my wife, I couldn't talk to her because she just gets terrified. So there was nobody to talk to. So here I am, and I had no cognitive map of this, where it goes or what the rules were or anything. But I'm still thinking, okay, they're still in this guy's head, and they can't come out. So even though I have no right to interfere with their way of life, what I figured they might be able to do, and which they've done with other people a lot of times is get the patient to attack, but they couldn't do it themselves, I didn't think. But, I believed at that time, I believed they couldn't come out of that guy's head and do anything. The only way they could
make him attack
But
you.
they could make him attack me. But none of them ever did. It was interesting. They would tell me that the voices were telling them that they should attack me, but none of them ever did.
Well, because they knew you were helping. I think you were helping them. That's why.
That's what I thought, but that wasn't the case. So this same guy, what I was doing was reading some books written by some shamans. I think it was Miguel Ruiz and Carlos Castaneda, who were talking about these things and saying they were energy parasites, and that's exactly what I was seeing.
Yeah.
So what I did is I brought one of those books into the prison and marked off that paragraph where they were talking about this, and I pulled that patient back in, that prisoner back in, and said, I have something here that's talking about what I think are your voices. I'd like your opinion on this. So he sat there and I started reading, and soon as it got to the point where they were talking about the voices being predatory parasites, behind my head, the wall started crackling with electricity. It was like an arc welder went off behind my head, and then it starts moving to my right onto the right-hand wall, and I'm staring at it, and I look at him, and he's in this like trance type state. He's just staring at me. He's not showing any reaction to this loud electronic crackling. He's just staring at me, and I start switching my attention between him and the wall where the crackling is, and I don't see anything on that wall. I just hear this loud crackling. It's just like somebody's running an arc welder up that wall. So he's staring at me with this crazy look on his face, just like he looked like a zombie. So I went, he's going to attack me, and I pushed my chair back against the wall, so if he comes at me, I can kick him away. And they always assigned a female to the medical unit, a female guard, and by the time they ever got there, it would be all over, and there was little they'd be able to do anyway except call for backup, and that would take 15, 20 minutes for somebody to get there. So I was virtually on my own in there, and I'm glancing real quickly between the inmate and the crackling, and it's moving at a 45-degree angle up the right-hand wall of my office toward the far corner on the right. And I'm glancing back and forth. I was afraid to take my eyes off him for any length of time, but I was struggling to see what it was making the crackling sound, and I could see nothing. I could smell nothing. There was nothing except that crackling sound. And this is going on.
They manifested some kind of sound to make you realize that they were doing something.
Well, at that time, at the time this was going on, I didn't know what was happening. I just knew it was not normal.
They wanted to frighten you. That's for sure.
Well, they most certainly did. And that crackling sound moved across the back wall right over the inmate's head. So it was easy to keep an eye on him there because it was directly over him. And then it went all the way to the left wall and started coming down at a 45-degree angle on the left wall, just crackling all the way. Crack, 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 just like an arc welder. And again, I'm switching my attention back and forth as fast as I can between this cracking to try to see anything. And there was nothing to be seen. And this inmate, who I suspected they were telling him to attack me, but I didn't know for sure because he was just sitting there like a zombie. So I finally asked him, I said, "Do you hear that?" And he doesn't answer. He's just staring at me, with this zombie-like look on his face. He's just staring. And this crackling noise keeps coming down, and it jumps into this Rubbermaid trash can right next to my left leg. And I looked down there, and the inmate porter had cleaned it the night before, and there's nothing in there. just this crackling sound. And then it stops, and I look at him, and he gets up very, like, rigid. He stands up like he's, I don't know, like somebody stunned him or something. I mean, it was a very rigid stand-up, and he goes, "I need to leave." And I'm going, thank God, yeah. I'm thinking in my head, yeah, get the hell out of here. Do it fast. Go.
Oh, God.
I'm sitting there watching him shuffle out of the office, and then after he walks down the hall, I hear him disappear down the hall. I go and I inspect the walls, and there's no marks on them. There's no evidence that anything had ever happened. And then I go out into the hall to see if there was anything that could account for that loud crackling, and there was nothing. And all the doors from all the other offices were closed and locked. I went and tested each one of them. There was nobody there. And that's when, I went, okay, they can affect physical reality. So they've warned me. They've demonstrated they can affect physical reality. And I was so freaked out by this that I didn't call that guy back for 2 to 3 months. I didn't want to.
Don't blame you.
I didn't want to talk to him. But then, maybe 3 months later, I called him back, and he looked good. I was expecting him to be a wreck. And I was shocked that he wasn't. Because if they could do that, then they must have taken a lot more control over him. But what he said is, I've been doing some of the things you told me to, and I'm keeping them down. And he looked good. He had a lot of energy, and that shocked me. And then we did
something to help him then, and that's really good of you.
Well, after that happened, I again closed my office and canceled all my appointments. Because I was trying to wrap my head around what had just
happened. You had to process all this.
Yeah, and there was nobody to process it with that wouldn't lock me up. So I couldn't, like I said, I couldn't even tell my wife because she gets terrified. So I couldn't.
This is the most enjoyable interview I've had. Although I'm going to die on the keyboard translating and subtitling this. Because we've gone over 2 hours now.
Oh, wow.
But still, it was the most enjoyable interview I've ever done. I feel my audience is going to appreciate the info given here, the results of your research. They're going to see another story, another way of looking at all this, and I think they're going to benefit from hearing you, sir.
Well, hopefully so. You want to hear the end of that story?
Yeah, please.
Okay, so what I did, 3 months later, I called him back, and like I said, he looked good. And we did some small talk, and then I asked him, I said, did you hear that crackling that went around my office the last time you were here? And he said, yes, I did, but I was surprised that you did, meaning I did.
Yeah.
And I said, what was that? And he said, that was them. And I asked, them, you mean the voices? He said, yes. I said, the voices made that noise? He said, yes. I said, what were they trying to do? He said, well, they were trying to scare you off.
Exactly.
And I said, they did a damn good job of it. I said, and then I asked him, I said, what were they telling you when you got up and shuffled out of my office looking like a zombie? What were they telling you then? And he said, they were telling me to go get a shank, which is a homemade prison knife, and stick it in your belly. And I was like, whoa.
Oh, no
and then
surprise there.
and then I asked him. I said, "Well, why didn't you do that?" And I'm thinking, "Oh yeah, I've been working with this guy for like 6 months. I mean, we know each other very well. You know, I've helped him out a great deal. I mean, he's getting better." And I said, "Why didn't you do it?" He said, "I couldn't find one."
Yeah.
And I was like, "Whoa."
Well, the good Lord wanted you alive. He wanted you to live to tell the story.
Well, I've got many more. That was just the beginning.
Yeah, and you'll tell us many more, because I'm sure my audience would want to hear more of you and more from you. But at this point, I think we have to wrap up.
Okay.
Because if I am to subtitle this in order to upload it, we'll have to wrap up at some point over here. But I am so grateful and I'm so honored that you took the time to talk to me and to relay all this info and all these messages to the Greeks. I'm sure the Greeks, speaking on their behalf, are very grateful to you, sir.
Well, I'm impressed with your going through all the trouble to not only find me and get this information, but then to turn around and subtitle this all in Greek for your people. So
it's be Greek for you, but it's going to be just right for me.
Well, that impresses me very much. And
I thank you very much for doing this for us. Greece needs all the help she can get from every angle, from every aspect of life. And if this is going to broaden their horizons a little more, it's a good thing. And you've contributed a hell of a lot, sir.
Well, those cabal that are beating the crap out of your country right now are eating up with these things.
I know they are.
You know?
I know they are. And I think most of the Greeks at this point know that they are. Thank you again.
All right, well, we'll finish up. I got a lot more stories. We can do this again later on after you're done this thing. But
of course we will.
You are more than welcome. I
know there's going to be a demand to hear from you again, from my audience. I am absolutely certain of that.
Well, it's my pleasure.
Thank you very much, sir. Be well, God bless, and keep up the great work you're doing.
Okay. You're welcome.
Thank you. Bye.
All right.